For 80 years, the photograph existed in darkness. It wasn't framed and proudly displayed above a fireplace. It wasn't slipped into a family album beside birthday parties and weddings. It was folded, once, then twice, pressed flat and hidden inside a worn leather Bible, printed in 1939. Its pages thin as onion skin and edged in fading gold. The Bible itself had belonged to the family patriarch, a quiet man whose war stories were sparse and carefully measured. After his death, the book was boxed with other belongings and stored in an attic, where dust gathered in soft, undisturbed layers. Generations passed beneath that roof, without knowing what rested inches above their heads. The discovery came by accident. A granddaughter, sorting through heirlooms before the house was to be sold, opened the Bible out of curiosity, rather than reverence. She expected dried flowers, perhaps a bookmark, maybe a handwritten verse. Instead, something stiff slipped from between the pages of the Book of Psalms and fluttered to the floor. The photograph landed face down. It was black and white, the edges scalloped, the surface cracked by time. The image had been preserved by pressure and darkness, yet age had left its fingerprints. Faint creases, a slight curl at one corner, the ghost of a fold running vertically down the center. When she turned it over, she didn't immediately understand what she was seeing. At first glance, it was ordinary. A group of soldiers standing beside a stone building somewhere in Europe. Their uniforms were crisp, despite the mud beneath their boots. A transport truck lingered in the background. The men's expressions were guarded, suspended between fatigue and forced camaraderie. War photography often captures that same tension, the fragile performance of normalcy against the machinery of violence. Then she recognized him. Her grandfather stood slightly to the left of center. Younger, leaner, the lines of age erased from his face. His jaw was sharper, his eyes brighter. He was not the silver-haired man who used to sit silently at family gatherings, hands folded over a cane. He was a soldier, alert, upright, almost defiant. The official family narrative had always been uncomplicated. He had served honorably during World War II, survived the brutality of combat, and returned home carrying burdens he rarely discussed. He married, raised children, built a small business, and never sought attention. When asked about the war, he spoke of cold winters, long marches, and lost friends. The family respected the silence, interpreting it as pain too heavy to reopen. But the photograph did not align neatly with that story. Standing to his immediate right, shoulder nearly touching his, was another uniformed man. His attire was different, subtly at first glance, unmistakably upon closer inspection. The insignia on his collar bore the emblem of Nazi Germany. The eagle crest, though small in the image, was visible enough to freeze the breath in her throat. Her grandfather was not alone among Allied troops, as the family had always assumed. He was standing beside a German officer. The composition of the image was intimate. This was not a distant battlefield capture of opposing forces. The two men were close, too close for enemies. Their posture suggested familiarity. There was no tension in their proximity, no visible hostility. They looked like comrades. The discovery spread through the family like a quiet shockwave. At first, there were attempts to rationalize it. Perhaps it was staged. Perhaps he had been captured. Perhaps the insignia was misinterpreted. Old photographs can deceive, time can distort perception, but the details resisted dismissal. The building behind them appeared intact, not damaged by combat. No visible restraints suggested captivity. The grouping was deliberate, almost ceremonial. The soldiers were posed. As the photograph circulated among siblings and cousins, something else emerged, something even more unsettling. In the background, partially obscured by shadow near the doorway of the stone structure, stood a third figure. He was not centered. He was not posed. He seemed almost accidental to the frame. Yet the more they examined him, the more impossible it became to ignore his presence. His profile mirrored their grandfather's. The resemblance was uncanny, the same high cheekbones, the same arch of the brow. If the central figure represented the known history, this man represented a fracture in it. No one in the family recognized him. No stories had ever mentioned a brother serving abroad. No letters preserved in drawers spoke of such a person. And yet there he was, frozen in silver grain. The emotional shift within the family was subtle, but irreversible. What had begun as curiosity evolved into unease. They began revisiting memories, stray comments their grandfather had made, names he had muttered in sleep, the way he avoided certain documentaries on television. His silence, once interpreted as trauma, now felt like strategy. Records were pulled from archives. Military databases were searched. The dates of his service, previously accepted without question, were examined against deployment logs. There were gaps, small inconsistencies that until now had been overlooked. A transfer that was never clearly explained. A 6-month period with no documentation. A location listed vaguely as Western Front, without specificity. The photograph suggested that during that undocumented window, he had been somewhere he never admitted. Experts in wartime photography were consulted. The uniforms were analyzed. The insignia confirmed. The stone building in the background, after enhancement, bore architectural characteristics common to rural regions of occupied France. A faint marking on the truck hinted at a German supply unit, active in 1943. If their grandfather had been serving with Allied forces, why was he photographed in such close association with members of Nazi Germany? And who was the man in the doorway, who looked so much like him? As questions multiplied, so did the emotional weight of the image. It was no longer just a historical curiosity, it was a rupture in identity. Families construct their sense of self around inherited narratives, stories of sacrifice, resilience, honor. This photograph threatened to rewrite the foundation beneath those stories. There was also the matter of intent. The photograph had not been lost accidentally. It had been deliberately hidden, folded tightly, pressed between sacred pages, concealed in a book associated with morality, faith, and confession. Why keep it at all? If the image represented shame, why preserve it? If it represented guilt, why not destroy it? The decision to hide rather than discard suggested conflict. Perhaps he could not bear to see it, but could not bear to erase it either. The granddaughter who first discovered it described a strange feeling as she held the photograph under brighter light. It was not anger she felt, not yet. It was disorientation. The man she loved and trusted suddenly felt unknowable. The version of him preserved in childhood memory no longer aligned seamlessly with the young soldier staring back from the paper. The family patriarch had died, believing his secret was safe. He had been eulogized as a survivor, a provider, a man of quiet integrity. None of those descriptions were necessarily false, but they were incomplete. The photograph did not shout its accusations. It did not provide explicit evidence of wrongdoing. It offered something more destabilizing: ambiguity. It raised the possibility that history within a single family could be layered, complex, and morally compromised. And perhaps most haunting of all was the expression on his face. He was not smiling. He was not grim. His eyes were focused slightly away from the camera, as though anticipating something beyond the frame. There was a tension in his jaw that suggested strain. Standing beside the German officer, he did not appear triumphant or defeated. He appeared conflicted. In that still moment captured 8 decades earlier lived a question that refused to settle. Who was he in that instant? A prisoner? A collaborator? A negotiator? A brother standing beside someone he loved, despite the uniform he wore? The photograph withheld its answers. As days passed, the image was scanned, enlarged, scrutinized. Tiny details emerged under magnification: the stitching of fabric, the faint shadow cast by the doorway figure, the almost imperceptible crease near their grandfather's hand, as if his fingers had been clenched into a fist. The family gathered one evening around a dining table, the photograph placed at the center, like evidence in a trial no one had prepared for. Voices were hushed. No one wanted to say the worst possibility aloud. The word traitor hovered unspoken. So did spy, defector, and survivor. What changed in that room was not merely their understanding of the past. It was their understanding of each other. They began questioning what stories they themselves might be shaping for future generations. what details they soften, what silences they inherit without noticing. The photograph, hidden for 80 years, had done what time could not. It disrupted certainty. In the end, its greatest power was not in what it conclusively revealed, but in what it forced them to confront. History is rarely clean, war is rarely simple, and the people we love often contain chapters we were never meant to read. The image remained on the table long after the conversation faded. Outside, evening settled into darkness. The attic where it had slept for decades stood nearly empty now, its boxes sorted, its secrets disturbed. For 80 years the photograph had waited in silence. Now, finally seen, it refused to be quiet. At first, the family believed the shock of the photograph had reached its limit. A hidden image, a troubling uniform, an unanswered question. That alone felt like enough to fracture a legacy. But it was the figure in the background, the one partially swallowed by shadow, who would unravel something far deeper. He stood near the doorway of the stone building, just behind the others, as if unsure whether he belonged in the frame. Unlike the posed soldiers at the center, he seemed caught mid-motion, one shoulder slightly turned away. His cap was pulled low, obscuring part of his face, yet enough remained visible to make the resemblance undeniable. The same bone structure, the same narrow bridge of the nose, the same intensity in the eyes. When the photograph was enlarged and digitally enhanced, the likeness sharpened. It was no trick of grain or imagination. The man in the doorway looked like a younger echo of their grandfather. The family tree, carefully maintained in binders and online genealogy platforms, listed only one son born to their great-grandparents during that era. There were no mentions of twins, no records of siblings who died in infancy. Census documents from the 1920s and 1930s showed a small household: father, mother, one boy. Neighbors interviewed decades earlier for an anniversary article in the local newspaper had described him as an only child. The narrative had been consistent, and yet the photograph suggested otherwise. The first step was to verify what they believed they already knew. Birth records were requested again from regional archives in Europe. The official certificate confirmed a single male child born in 1922. No twin notation, no amendment. But war has a way of disrupting documentation. Records are lost, names are altered. Children are sometimes sent away, hidden, or informally adopted by relatives without legal trace. The possibility of a forgotten brother lingered like a shadow at the edge of every conversation. It was a distant cousin, an amateur historian with patience for bureaucracy, who uncovered the first crack in the official story. While combing through parish baptism logs that predated civil registry digitization, she found an entry from the same month and year as their grandfather's birth. 2 boys, baptized on the same day. The surnames matched. The parents' names matched. The ink was faded, but legible. The notation beside the second child's name was brief and cryptic. Removed from household, 1933. No explanation followed. The year itself was ominous. 1933 marked the rise of Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler, a political shift that rippled across borders and altered countless destinies. If there had indeed been 2 brothers, their adolescence would have unfolded during one of the most volatile periods in European history. The family sat with the revelation in stunned silence. An erased sibling was one thing, but the timing suggested something more deliberate than childhood illness or accidental death. Removed from household implied intervention, separation, perhaps conflict. Further research revealed school enrollment documents listing both boys during early childhood. Teachers' remarks described them as inseparable, often mistaken for one another, competitive yet protective. Then, abruptly, one name disappeared from the rolls after 1933. No death certificate accompanied the disappearance. No burial record surfaced. It was as though the second brother had dissolved into air. The next discovery arrived through military archives. A search of enlistment records during World War II revealed 2 men bearing the same surname and nearly identical birth dates, differing by only minutes. One record aligned with the grandfather's known service history. The other, however, indicated enlistment within a German unit stationed in occupied France in 1943. The implications were staggering. 2 brothers, same blood, opposite sides of the war. If the man in the photograph's background was indeed the missing sibling, Then the image captured more than a questionable alliance. It documented a reunion. Family lore had always portrayed their grandfather as fiercely patriotic, unwavering in his loyalty. But patriotism in a divided Europe was not always straightforward. Borders shifted. Occupations forced choices upon civilians. Some enlisted out of ideology, others out of coercion. Some simply to survive. What could drive identical brothers toward opposing uniforms? Speculation filled the void where documentation failed. Perhaps ideological differences had fractured them long before the war. Perhaps economic hardship compelled one to seek opportunity wherever it appeared. Or perhaps one had been pressured, threatened, or conscripted under circumstances too complex to judge decades later. But the photograph complicated any simple explanation. The two men were not positioned like enemies encountering each other by chance. They stood within the same group, within arm's reach. There was no visible hostility in their posture. Instead, there was something heavier, an unspoken gravity. It was as if the camera had captured a moment suspended between loyalty and betrayal. Letters preserved in an old tin box offered further fragments. Most were written by the grandfather to his parents during the early years of the war. They were cautious in tone, filled with mundane details about weather and rations, but one letter from late 1943 stood apart. In it, he wrote a single line that had never before drawn attention. Some bonds are not broken by borders, no matter how hard men try. At the time, the sentence had seemed poetic, even sentimental. Now it felt like confession. Military intelligence files obtained through formal request revealed that the German unit connected to the second enlistment record had been involved in operations near Lyon, France. The timeline aligned precisely with the estimated date of the photograph, based on uniform insignia and environmental clues. It was possible, painfully possible, that the brothers had crossed paths in occupied territory. The family began to imagine the unimaginable. Did they recognize each other immediately? Did shock silence them, or did anger ignite first? Did they argue in private, hidden behind stone walls? Or did they agree to a fragile truce, choosing blood over ideology, if only briefly? War is rarely a battlefield divided neatly into good and evil. It is a terrain of survival, compromise, and impossible choices. Brothers raised under the same roof can emerge shaped by different fears, different influences, different promises, whispered by those in power. If one brother had aligned himself with Nazi Germany, whether willingly or under duress, the shame would have been immense after the war's end. Families across Europe concealed such affiliations to avoid retribution and ostracism. Records were altered, names were changed, silence became armor. Perhaps that explained the parish notation, removed from household. It might not have meant physical removal at all. It could have signified ideological exile, long before military enlistment. A family distancing itself from a son whose beliefs or associations threatened them all. But exile does not erase blood. The photograph suggested that, at least once, the brothers stood within the same space again. Whether by accident or intention, their reunion was documented, and then it was hidden. No post-war documents referenced the second brother's fate. There was no immigration record, no obituary, no trace in displaced persons registries. His name appeared only in the German military listing, after which it vanished. Historians consulted by the family proposed several possibilities. He could have died in combat without proper identification. He could have been captured and executed. He could have assumed a new identity to avoid prosecution. Or he could have been quietly helped by someone who felt bound by something stronger than politics. The most haunting possibility was this, that the grandfather had known exactly what became of him. If the letter found behind the photograph hinted at regret and divided loyalty, perhaps it was written not merely about wartime orders, but about a brother lost in more ways than one. The emotional toll on the family was profound. The discovery forced them to reconsider inherited narratives of moral clarity. It challenged the simplicity of hero and villain, patriot and traitor. It introduced a painful ambiguity into their lineage. They found themselves grieving someone they had never known. The missing brother became a presence in their conversations, an absence that felt newly tangible. Children asked questions that adults struggled to answer. Was he evil? Was he forced? Did he regret his choice? Did he survive long enough to seek forgiveness? No photograph showed his face clearly enough to read emotion. No diary revealed his thoughts. He existed only in fragments, ink in a parish book, a line in a military roster, a shadow in a doorway. Yet his impact reverberated across generations. The family's understanding of identity shifted. They began to see their grandfather not solely as a silent veteran, but as a man who may have carried the weight of a divided brotherhood. His quiet demeanor, once attributed purely to trauma, might also have been shaped by loyalty to someone history condemned. Silence in this context was not merely repression, it was protection. Perhaps he believed that speaking his brother's name would stain his children's future. Perhaps he feared that association alone would bring scrutiny. Or perhaps the pain of losing him, whether to ideology or death, was too raw to articulate. In the end, the missing brother remained missing in every official sense, but he was no longer erased. The photograph had restored him to memory, if not to record. Two boys baptized on the same day, two soldiers in opposing uniforms, one family forced to confront the truth that history does not divide neatly along moral lines. The war had ended in 1945, but for these brothers, its consequences lingered in silence for 80 years. And when the hidden image finally surfaced, it revealed not just a secret, but a fracture that had shaped a family without them ever knowing it. Some bonds, as the letter said, are not broken by borders. The letter was folded so tightly behind the photograph that it seemed fused to it, as if paper had grown into paper over the decades. When they carefully separated the two, fibers lifted and flaked at the edges. The ink had bled slightly where moisture must have once seeped in, but most of the words remained legible, thin, deliberate strokes, written in a hand the family recognized instantly. Their grandfather's handwriting had always been distinctive, upright, disciplined, almost severe. Even birthday cards he signed in old age carried that same controlled precision. Seeing those familiar lines formed in ink dated 1944 sent a chill through the room. The past was no longer abstract. It was speaking. There was no greeting, no dear mother or my love. Just a date scrawled at the top, October 18th, 1944. Beneath it, a location written without flourish, near Lyon. The mention of Lyon immediately drew attention. Historians know the region as a center of resistance during the occupation of France, but also as a place where brutal reprisals unfolded. The area saw executions, deportations, and coordinated crackdowns carried out under the authority of Nazi Germany. Civilians disappeared into prisons. Entire villages were silenced. The letter did not describe events in graphic detail. It did something more unsettling. It circled them. We followed orders, one line read. Some orders leave a mark no water can wash away. There was no explicit admission of wrongdoing, no description of a specific act, but the tone carried weight. The phrasing was careful, as if the writer feared even the page might betray him. Another sentence stood out. He chose differently, and I cannot say whether he was braver than I. The pronoun hung in the air. He. No name followed. But, after the discovery of the missing brother, the implication felt unavoidable. If the photograph had documented a reunion, the letter suggested its aftermath. The family read the page in silence, each person absorbing different words, different pauses between lines. The letter did not present a clear confession. It offered fragments of conscience. We stood where stone remembers, it continued. The villagers would not look at us. I do not blame them. Stone remembers, the phrase echoed. It suggested a place marked by violence, perhaps a courtyard, perhaps a wall against which men had been lined up. The reference to villagers refusing eye contact implied guilt, or at least awareness of complicity. The letter's final paragraph was the most revealing and the most restrained. History will not ask how we felt, he wrote. It will only record what was done. If there is mercy, it will not be written. The document ended without signature, only initials. Initials that matched his full name. For decades, the family had accepted his silence as the natural reticence of a war veteran. Trauma often hides in quiet habits. But this letter suggested something more complex than suppressed memory. It suggested moral conflict. To understand the gravity of what might have occurred near Lyon in October 1944, the family consulted historians and archival records. That period was marked by intensified resistance activity and equally intensified retaliation. German forces, along with collaborators in various units operating under shifting alliances, conducted operations to suppress partisan networks. Arrests were frequent. Executions were not uncommon. It was possible that their grandfather had been present during one such operation. Whether as a direct participant, a witness, or a powerless subordinate, remained unclear. The phrase, "we followed orders," carried enormous historical weight. After the war, those words echoed in courtrooms during the Nuremberg trials, where defendants invoked obedience as defense. The trials established a moral precedent. Following orders did not absolve responsibility. But this letter was written before the war ended, before tribunals and verdicts. It was written in the moment, by a man still embedded in the machinery of conflict. He chose differently. The sentence demanded interpretation. If it referred to his brother, perhaps the missing sibling had refused an order. Perhaps he had defected. Perhaps he had attempted to shield civilians or resist an execution. The letter offered no clarity, only contrast. The family debated possibilities late into the night. One theory suggested that the brothers, reunited in occupied France, found themselves on opposite sides of a moral divide as well as a military one. If an order had come down to punish a village suspected of aiding resistance fighters, perhaps one complied and the other resisted. Another theory was darker. Perhaps both complied, and one later broke ranks, unable to continue. The phrase, "I cannot say whether he was braver than I," implied comparison, regret, envy of courage. The letter's restraint made it more haunting. There were no emotional outbursts, no dramatic pleas for forgiveness, just a steady acknowledgement of something that could not be undone. The family sought corroboration in military archives. Records confirmed that units operating near Lyon in October 1944 were involved in coordinated sweeps of rural communities. Some operations resulted in deportations to camps. Others ended in summary executions. The possibility that their grandfather had been present at such an event fractured the narrative they had inherited. And yet the letter did not read like the voice of a cruel man. It read like the voice of someone grappling with consequence. "I thought loyalty was simple," one line stated. "Now I see it divides the heart." That sentence resonated deeply. Loyalty to country, loyalty to brother, loyalty to survival. In wartime, these allegiances collide. Choosing one can feel like betraying another. The letter also revealed something subtle but profound. It had been kept, hidden but preserved. If he had wanted the words erased, he could have burned them. Paper is fragile, ink fades in flame. Instead, he folded it behind the photograph and sealed both within a Bible. The symbolism was difficult to ignore, a moral reckoning tucked inside Scripture. Perhaps he intended for it to be found one day. Or perhaps he could not bring himself to destroy the only written acknowledgement of what happened. Guilt often seeks witness, even if delayed. The family began to reassess stories from his later life, his aversion to certain films, his quiet withdrawal during news segments about war crimes, his insistence that morality is rarely as clear as people pretend. In light of the letter, those behaviors seemed less abstract. The grandchildren felt a complex mix of emotions: sorrow, confusion, reluctant empathy. It is one thing to learn that an ancestor may have been near atrocity. It is another to read his own conflicted words about it. The letter did not confirm direct participation in violence. It did not list names or numbers. It existed in the gray space between action and witness. But gray space can still stain. Historians reminded the family that wartime units were often composed of conscripts and volunteers operating under intense pressure. Refusal could mean imprisonment or execution. Fear distorts judgment. Survival instincts override ideals. None of that erased responsibility, but it complicated it. The mention of Lyon also intersected with resistance history. The city was associated with figures like Jean Moulin, whose efforts to unify resistance movements made the region a focal point of German attention. Crackdowns were ruthless. If their grandfather had been stationed there, he would have stood at the crossroads of ideology and insurgency, where lines between soldier and civilian blurred dangerously. The family never found definitive proof of his exact role. No roster placed him at a specific execution. No witness testimony named him. The letter remained the only personal artifact tying him emotionally to events in that region at that time. And yet its existence altered everything. In its place emerged a portrait of a young man entangled in forces larger than himself, struggling to reconcile obedience with conscience. The most painful realization was that history, as he predicted, would not record how he felt. Official records document movements, affiliations, outcomes. They rarely capture internal conflict. His words, fragile and fading, were the only evidence that he had questioned. The family eventually decided to preserve the letter properly, archived in protective casing, digitally scanned, translated for younger generations, not as condemnation, not as absolution, but as acknowledgement. The photograph had revealed a hidden association. The letter revealed a hidden burden. Together they told a story not of simple villainy or virtue, but of a divided heart in a divided time. When the family gathered months later to discuss what to do with these discoveries, one member read aloud the closing line of the letter. "If there is mercy, it will not be written." Perhaps mercy, they realized, is not found in official histories or public records. Perhaps it lives in the willingness of descendants to confront truth without denial. The letter did not clear his name. It did not condemn it beyond repair. It did something more difficult. It forced them to see him fully human. And in that humanity, flawed, conflicted, silent for 80 years, they found not resolution, but understanding. After the war ended, the world rushed to rebuild. Cities were reconstructed from rubble. Governments reorganized, borders redrawn. In the chaos of transition, records were lost, amended, and sometimes quietly rewritten. For millions displaced across Europe, survival depended not only on food and shelter, but on narrative, on what could be proven and what could be left unsaid. It was during this fragile period that the family patriarch reshaped his life. Official documents show that in 1951, he applied for immigration to the United States. The paperwork describes him as a laborer, unmarried, with prior military service in defense of homeland. The phrasing is vague, almost sterile. There is no mention of Leon, no reference to a brother, no detail beyond dates and locations that align cleanly with Allied positions. The 6-month gap previously noted in his wartime record is absent from these forms. The timeline appears seamless, as if the missing stretch of history had never existed. Immigration officers processing thousands of applications in the early 1950s focused primarily on security risks and labor potential. The Cold War had begun to define political anxieties. Allegiances were scrutinized, but documentation standards were inconsistent, especially for applicants from war-torn regions where records had been destroyed. If a man presented himself as a survivor rather than a collaborator, and if no immediate evidence contradicted him, the path forward often opened. The family discovered that upon arrival in New York Harbor, he anglicized the spelling of his surname slightly, removing a letter that softened its European pronunciation. The change was minor, almost unnoticeable to strangers, but symbolically, it marked the beginning of a new chapter. In his naturalization interview transcript, he stated simply, "I served, I survived, I wished to work." There were no elaborations. By 1953, he had married a woman who had also immigrated from Europe. Together, they settled in a modest neighborhood, raised children, and attended church regularly. Photographs from this period show a man determined to appear steady. He smiled at christenings, barbecues, school recitals. He built a small carpentry business. Neighbors described him as reserved, but reliable. The silence that had begun during the war did not lift in peacetime. When asked about his experiences, he offered rehearsed fragments. He spoke of cold winters and hunger, of long marches and fear of artillery fire. He did not mention Leon. He did not mention moral conflict. He did not mention a brother. Silence became habit. Habit became shield. The family began to realize that this silence was not passive. It was structured, intentional. Documents from his early years in America reveal small but significant discrepancies. A military discharge certificate lists a unit designation that historians later determined had been reorganized after 1943. The revision effectively obscured prior affiliations. Whether this alteration occurred through bureaucratic error or deliberate request remains unclear. In the 1950s, as public awareness of wartime atrocities expanded and trials publicized the crimes of the defeated regime, association with certain units could carry stigma, even in distant countries. To build a future free of suspicion, some immigrants minimized or recontextualized their service. There is no evidence that he faced formal investigation, but the broader climate of accountability would have been impossible to ignore. The family unearthed one particularly telling detail, a letter of recommendation submitted with his immigration application. It came from a former commanding officer who had resettled earlier in the United States. The letter described him as disciplined and cooperative, but avoided specifying the exact nature of their shared service. The language was carefully non-committal. It was as though everyone involved understood that clarity was dangerous. In his new country, he cultivated an identity rooted in industriousness rather than ideology. He volunteered occasionally at local events. He paid taxes on time. He avoided political discussions, especially those concerning Europe. When news reports covered post-war trials or the emerging scholarship about occupation policies, he would leave the room quietly. His children grew up believing their father's silence stemmed from trauma. They interpreted his reluctance as pain too deep to revisit, and perhaps that was true, but it was also protective. To speak openly might have required acknowledging moral ambiguity. It might have risked questions that had no safe answers. The grandchildren recall that he kept very few personal artifacts from the war. No medals were displayed, no uniform preserved in a trunk, only the Bible, within which the photograph and letter were hidden. The choice to conceal rather than destroy those items suggests a man divided between erasure and remembrance. He wanted the world to see one version of him, the survivor who rebuilt. But he could not completely extinguish the other. In the 1960s, as civil rights movements reshaped American discourse about justice and accountability, his silence deepened. Conversations about moral responsibility, about complicity in unjust systems, gained prominence. He listened, but rarely contributed. Family members later recalled moments that in hindsight felt loaded with unspoken meaning. Once, during a discussion about obedience and authority, he remarked, "Doing what you are told is not always the same as doing what is right." At the time, it seemed like a general statement. Now it reads like a confession. The post-war decades allowed him to construct a stable life, but stability required maintenance. The altered surname, the simplified service record, the absence of a brother, these omissions formed a protective architecture. Immigration files from that era, preserved in national archives, reveal how common such reinventions were. People displaced by conflict often reshaped their identities to secure safety. Some concealed affiliations out of fear of prosecution. Others did so to escape retribution from former enemies. The line between survival strategy and deception blurred easily. There is no evidence that he committed prosecutable crimes. There is no record of his name appearing in war crime investigations. But the letter found decades later indicates that his conscience bore weight. Silence in this context functioned as both shield and burden. By the time his children were adults, the version of history he presented had solidified into fact. He was a veteran. He endured hardship. He rebuilt honorably. The family's pride rested on that foundation. When he died, the eulogies reflected the narrative he had curated. Words like integrity, strength, and devotion filled the church. No one questioned the simplicity of his story. Why would they? He had lived consistently with the image he projected. The discovery of the hidden materials decades later did not erase the life he built. It complicated it. The family began to understand that post-war reinvention was not uncommon. Europe in the late 1940s was saturated with individuals carrying compromised histories. Others blended into the vast migration reshaping continents. In the United States, particularly during the early Cold War years, Scrutiny often prioritized ideological alignment against communism rather than detailed examination of every wartime affiliation. Bureaucratic overload, political urgency, and incomplete records created opportunities for selective disclosure. His immigration coincided with this transitional moment. The grandchildren wrestled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, they recognized the courage required to start over in a foreign land. On the other, they confronted the possibility that their family's stability rested partly on omission. Was silence an act of deception, or an act of mercy toward future generations? Perhaps both. The missing brother's absence from official documents now seemed less mysterious. If acknowledging him risked exposing uncomfortable affiliations, erasure might have felt necessary. To build a new life in America, he may have believed that certain truths had to remain buried. And so they were, for 80 years. The post-war decades allowed wounds to scar over without examination. Children grew up, careers flourished, holidays were celebrated, the past retreated into shadow. But shadows lengthen with time. The photograph and letter disrupted the carefully constructed narrative, but they did not wholly dismantle it. Instead, they revealed the cost of maintaining it. Silence protected reputation. It shielded children from stigma. It allowed a man to redefine himself beyond the worst moment of his life. Yet silence also isolated him. In his later years, those closest to him noticed a persistent restlessness. He would wake early, sit alone with coffee before dawn. Sometimes he would open the Bible, though no one realized what lay hidden within it. He rarely spoke during those moments. It is possible he revisited the photograph privately, weighing memory against identity. It is possible he reread the letter, tracing his own younger handwriting with aged fingers. If so, he carried the burden alone. When the family gathered to discuss what they had learned, they acknowledged something difficult. The life he built in America was real. His kindness to neighbors was real. His devotion to his children was real. So was the silence. The post-war reinvention did not erase the man he had been near Leon. It layered over him. In the end, the reckoning was not about exposing scandal to the public. It was about understanding the complexity within their own lineage. The American chapter of his life was not a lie, but it was incomplete. History often celebrates reinvention as triumph, but reinvention sometimes requires selective memory. The silence that protected his reputation also protected them from questions they were not prepared to ask. Until now, when the photograph and letter were finally authenticated, the family could no longer retreat into uncertainty. What had once been speculation hardened into historical probability. Archivists compared uniform insignia, cross-referenced unit movements, and examined paper composition. Specialists consulted collections at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, confirming that the insignia visible in the image matched a German unit operating in occupied France in late 1943. The stonework in the background aligned with architectural surveys from villages near Lyon. Even the type of photographic paper corresponded with materials commonly used in field photography during that period. The past had been verified. It was not a forgery. It was not a misunderstanding of symbols. It was a genuine artifact from a real moment in wartime Europe. For the family, the authentication marked a turning point. Before, there had been room for doubt, for hopeful reinterpretation. Now, they were faced with something more solid. Their grandfather had stood in proximity to men serving under Nazi command. He had written words that implied moral compromise. He had hidden both behind scripture and carried the secret across an ocean. The reckoning did not come as a single dramatic confrontation. It unfolded gradually, in living rooms and quiet phone calls, in late-night reflections and tense family gatherings. Some relatives reacted with defensiveness, insisting that context mattered above all else. Others felt betrayed, as though a foundational truth had been quietly withdrawn from beneath them. One cousin, a history teacher, framed it bluntly. "We are not responsible for what he did, but we are responsible for what we do with it." That statement lingered. Reckoning, they realized, was not about assigning punishment to a man long deceased. It was about deciding whether to confront complexity or to preserve comfort. For decades, their family narrative had functioned as a source of pride. It had shaped identity. The story of survival, immigration, and hard work had been passed down as moral inheritance. To acknowledge ambiguity felt, at first, like diminishing that inheritance. But as weeks passed, something shifted. The more they examined the evidence, the more they recognized that complexity did not erase resilience, it deepened it. They began by gathering every available document: military records, immigration papers, parish logs, letters. They created digital copies, not to expose publicly but to ensure preservation. Secrets thrive in fragility. Transparency, even within a family, requires structure. Conversations grew more nuanced. Instead of asking whether he was hero or villain, they asked different questions. What choices were available to a young man in occupied Europe? What pressures shaped those choices? What does it mean to obey when obedience conflicts with conscience? Historians consulted by the family emphasized that war collapses moral clarity. Survival, ideology, coercion, and fear intertwine. Some individuals actively embraced violent systems. Others navigated them reluctantly. Distinguishing between the two often requires evidence that time erases. The family confronted another unsettling realization. The letter did not read like triumph. It read like conflict. The photograph did not capture celebration. It captured tension. Perhaps the true fracture was not ideological allegiance, but divided loyalty, between nation and brother, between order and empathy. They also grappled with the generational impact of silence. Psychologists note that unspoken trauma can ripple through families, shaping behaviors and emotional patterns in ways descendants cannot easily trace. Their grandfather's quiet demeanor, his avoidance of certain topics, his rigid discipline, these traits now appeared in a different light. Silence had not simply concealed history, it had shaped atmosphere. Some relatives expressed anger, not at what he may have done, but at the decision to hide it. "We deserve to know," one said, "not because we would judge him, but because truth matters." Others argued that he might have believed silence was mercy. The post-war world was unforgiving. Accusations lingered. To protect his children from scrutiny, perhaps he chose erasure over explanation. Reckoning required holding both possibilities at once. Months after the authentication, the family organized a private gathering dedicated solely to confronting the discovery. They met not in a courtroom or public forum, but around the same dining table where the photograph had first been examined. On the table lay copies of the image and letter, carefully preserved. Each person spoke in turn. One granddaughter described feeling as though her childhood memories had been reframed, not erased, but shaded differently. A grandson admitted he struggled with the idea that his surname might once have been associated with something darker than survival. Another relative emphasized that moral complexity does not cancel love. As the discussion unfolded, a quiet consensus emerged. They would not deny the past, nor would they reduce it to a single label. The reckoning extended beyond family boundaries. They debated whether to share the materials with historical archives, contributing to broader scholarship about wartime gray zones. Others believed that confronting history publicly was an act of integrity. In the end, they decided to provide copies, without sensationalism, without accusation, allowing historians to contextualize the artifacts within larger narratives of occupation and divided families. It was a small act, but significant. Reckoning also involved personal reflection. Many began examining their own responses to authority, their own definitions of loyalty. The letter's line, "History will not ask how we felt," echoed differently now. Perhaps history does not record emotion, but descendants can. They asked themselves whether they would have acted differently in his place. The question was uncomfortable, impossible to answer honestly without humility. War compresses time and magnifies consequence. Decisions made in seconds can define decades. The grandfather they knew had built a life of steadiness and care. The young soldier in the photograph had navigated a moral labyrinth few of them could fully imagine. The reckoning did not absolve him. It did not condemn him outright. It reframed him as human. There was grief in that realization, the grief of losing a simplified hero, but there was also unexpected relief. Heroes can feel distant, untouchable. Humans are closer, flawed, recognizable. The family also confronted the missing brother's absence anew. If he had chosen differently, as the letter suggested, what had that choice cost him? Did he survive? Did he pay with exile or execution? His erasure now felt less like a footnote and more like a wound. They lit a candle one evening in acknowledgement, not for a specific verdict, but for both brothers caught in opposing currents of history. Reckoning required accepting that their family story contained fracture. The children he raised, the kindness he showed neighbors, the work he built, all remained real. What changed was the frame. Instead of a linear narrative of honor and survival, their history became layered. A young man entangled in moral ambiguity, a brother divided by ideology, an immigrant reconstructing identity, a patriarch protecting silence. In time, the emotional intensity softened into contemplation. The photograph no longer sat at the center of the table. It was archived safely, but it remained present in memory. The grandchildren began speaking about it openly among themselves, not with shame, but with seriousness. They recognized that confronting uncomfortable truths strengthened rather than weakened their sense of identity. One of them articulated it clearly. We are not inheriting his guilt. We are inheriting his complexity. That distinction mattered. The reckoning ultimately shifted from external validation to internal alignment. They no longer needed to prove whether he was wholly innocent or irredeemable. They needed only to accept that he had been shaped by a brutal era and had carried its weight quietly. In the end, the photograph did more than reveal a hidden moment.